Hi everyone, chess lovers, and welcome back to Chessway. In today's video, we're going to look at a fascinating chess game played between Mikhail Tal and Andrich Stanowski in 1963. All right, the game begins with e4 followed by b6, then d4 and bishop to b7. Okay, white develops the bishop to d3, also protecting the pawn, but black immediately challenges that idea with f5. Pretty strange opening, right? If I'm not mistaken, this is called the Matavinsky gambit. The idea is simple. If the pawn takes, then the bishop can capture back. But opening up the king's diagonal with the queen and bishop already active, that's definitely not a good idea. Still, Tal stays calm and plays queen to e2. Now, black develops the knight to f6. In my opinion, that's even more suspicious because Tal can now push e5, taking control of the center and attacking the knight. In other words, Tal is actually allowing the bishop to capture on g2 here. So after Tal takes the knight, the bishop captures the rook. All right, the black player's idea has worked. Now he's up in material and even a pawn ahead. But let's take a closer look at that pawn on f6. It's actually very dangerous. The e-pawn is pinned to the queen, and if the g-pawn captures, queen to h5 is immediate checkmate. That's why I said earlier, opening the f-pawn when your queen and bishop are already developed is extremely risky. Now, white has several options here, but Tal is patient. He plays knight to c3 instead. And since this is a short game, I'll quickly show how dangerous this queen and bishop attack can be. Let's say black plays e6, defending the pawn and attacking the center with the queen. White can go bishop to g5, pinning and threatening check ideas. If black still decides to capture the pawn, then queen to h5, check. The king is forced to e7, and you can just sacrifice the bishop, check again. If the king takes the bishop, then queen to h4, check once more. Wherever the king goes, white will soon win the queen early in the game. So that's just to give you an idea of how risky black's setup really is. All right, back to the real game. How do you even deal with this dangerous f6 pawn? Honestly, you can't, but Stanowski tries g6, hoping to make the king a bit safer. Though I don't think it really helps because white could just take on f5, right? But now Tal finally plays bishop to g5. After that, black develops knight to c6, and here Mikhail Tal prepares for a full-scale attack with long castle. And just a note, if black captures the pawn with the knight, then queen to e5 would create deadly threats again. So black plays h6, trying to chase the bishop away. White could retreat to h4, but Tal does something insane. He sacrifices his bishop on f5. Wow, that's just incredible. If the h-pawn takes the bishop, then bishop takes f5, checkmate. So black tries king to f7 first, planning to capture later. But come on, this is Mikhail Tal. He doesn't need to save his bishops. He gives another bishop sacrifice, this time for a check. Brutal play from Tal. There are two options now. If the king retreats, the game will end quickly, because the king will be hunted by two bishops. So black is forced to capture the bishop. Actually, the best move here would have been bishop to h4, but Tal plays queen to d3, check. That's a mistake, because now the king has two options. If the king simply retreats to f7, white can't easily continue the attack. But again, this is a bishop sacrifice. If the only goal is to keep the king safe, then why not capture the bishop? That would remove an attacker and make the position safer, right? But Tal had already prepared knight to f3, check. But actually, Tal just wants to bring the rook out without losing tempo. So black captures the knight with the bishop. But guess what? That knight was just another sacrifice, because here comes pawn to h4, check. Now the king has several options, but the most logical one seems to be capturing the pawn, trying to hide afterward. But what if he tries to protect his bishop on g4 instead? Let's analyze that. If the king moves to g4, guarding the bishop, this gets really interesting. After rook to g1, check. If the king still wants to guard the bishop, he has to move to f4, right? But then comes another sacrifice, knight to d5, check. The king has nowhere to go, so the bishop takes the knight. And by doing that, the bishop leaves the diagonal open for queen to g3, check. Now there are two choices. If the king goes to e4, then queen to g4 is checkmate. So he's forced to f5 instead, but then queen to g6, check. Again, two choices, but wherever he goes, queen to g4 still ends in mate. So the king runs to e6, and Tal finishes it brilliantly with pawn to f7, checkmate. You can see it yourself. Black is up so much material, yet gets checkmated by a pawn. That's just heartbreaking. All right, let's go back to the main game. Here, the king doesn't protect the bishop, but captures the pawn instead. Now, Tal simply captures the bishop, check. There are three possible moves, but if the king goes to g6 or g7, then rook to g1, check, forces king to h7 and queen to f5, checkmate. So the king has to go to e6. Then comes pawn to d5, check. At this point, black's position is completely hopeless, but he keeps playing. King to e5, and it ends with queen to e4, check. And here, Andrich Stanowski resigns. Wow, what a brutal game. Even though Stanowski wasn't a grandmaster, we can still learn a lot from Tal's fearless attacking style. Actually, if the game continued, it could have ended even more epically. Because after that, if the king went to f6, as I mentioned earlier, queen to f4, check, and no matter where the king goes, rook to g1, check, forcing king to h7, and finally queen to f5, checkmate, a forced mating sequence. Or, the last possible line, if the king went to d6, after pawn takes knight, check, the king is forced to c5, and it ends perfectly with pawn to b4, checkmate. Absolutely epic. Checkmated by a pawn, king standing in the middle of the board, while black is up a rook. A perfect victory. But to be fair, I have to say, black's play really looked like a beginner's. He kept moving his king again and again. But that's not entirely his fault. Tal's moves were just that forcing. In my opinion, black's biggest mistake came right from the opening, playing such a weird setup and opening the f-pawn against one of the most dangerous attackers in history. So, it's no surprise that the entire game was controlled by Mikhail Tal. And all right, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from this wild and entertaining game. If I made any mistakes, please forgive me. Thanks for watching, chess lovers, and see you in the next video.